Welcome everybody. Today is the last of Sam Chambers' 3 Leverkusen lectures. Sam is returning to Baltimore, but he'll be back in December and in January next year for a 2-month visit, and there'll be one more lecture that Sam does then. These are all part of the book that is currently in preparation. So before starting, I just wanted to thank Sam personally for both his time here, but also the contribution to the PhD community, to the research community. Sam, for those of you who don't know, has been involved in working across a variety of different communities at Brighton, looking at in work around gender and sexuality, his contemporary research, looking at the work of Judith Butler, Jacques Rancière, and among others. So thank you, Sam. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. It's been a great pleasure, and we look forward to having you back. Having said all of that, there is now going to be a lecture on value theory. I know that there are a number of colleagues in the audience who know Marx's account of value very, very well. So I'm looking forward to both saying goodbye to Sam, but also arguing with Sam as we say goodbye to him when he leaves on Thursday of this week. So I'll turn over to Sam. Claire will offer some responses, some very brief indicative questions as a start, although she's now left the room, I think. And we'll then open up the discussion to the floor. Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
So as Mark said, I'm leaving on Thursday, which you should all know that means for me to thank for the weather that's just now turning nice and it's supposed to get even more beautiful over the weekend, since it's been miserable since I arrived here in the first week of February. But it's all about me. I'm going back to Baltimore where they had summer-like weather for the last 2 weeks and it's supposed to rain the entire time. So that's just think of me on Saturday when you're out on the beach. Since I am leaving now and will be gone for a number of months, I just wanted to take one more moment to thank all of you for letting me join you this spring, for welcoming me here and making me feel very much a part of a number of different communities in Brighton. And most of all, for giving to me really the greatest gift you can give any academic, and that's the time and labor of actually reading or listening to or engaging with his or her work. So thank you very much for that. What I want to do tonight is build a hinge, which is the hinge that links the ground clearing work I did in last week's lecture. That is the engagement with Wendy Brown, my articulation of the contemporary conjuncture's battle with neoliberalism. I want to link that with the work I plan to do in my final lecture at the end of the year, which will try to use the approach to capitalism I lay out tonight in order to theorize alternative economic forms and tactics of struggle against neoliberalism. It's one thing to show, as I did last week, that the economic and the political cannot be so easily dissociated as Brown might, at least for rhetorical purposes, wish them to be. It's quite another thing to demonstrate precisely how they are intertwined and to analyze the implications of their entanglement. So to help me carry out that work, I turned to perhaps less than obvious sources. First, some of the least famous writings of Marx, and then a strand of interpretation of Marx, value form theory, that is becoming much more prominent in the last few years, but hasn't exactly been the dominant reading of Marx over the past decades. Now, we can trace value form theory as a tradition of interpretation of Marx back to the lasting influence of Backhouse, a student of Adorno, whose 1965 seminar paper is probably now seen as the source point for what would later become value form theory, also often referred to as New Marx lecture. I want to be clear here at the beginning about my relation to value form theory. My aim is not to try to prove that the value form reading of Marx is correct. But the reason for that, I think, is because I believe that the value form theorists themselves have already proved that. The interesting point for me is different. It's that very few people seem to have necessarily altered their approach to Marx or Marxism or capitalism, despite the fact that value form theory emerged, burgeoned, and produced perhaps a better reading of Marx. And so because so few people have noticed, especially up until very recently in the last few years, this means that the idea of Marx as subscribing to some variant of a classical labor theory of value remains dominant. And it continues to inform a number of allusions to and readings of Marx. So my work isn't an intellectual history of value form theory or new Marx lecture, and it's not a narrow contribution back to this sometimes kind of closed circle of scholars communicating to one another within this literature. Rather, what I want to do tonight, and what I do in the paper that this lecture is based on, is take up a value form and genealogical approach to Marx as a way to rethink our contemporary relation to neoliberalism. So my aim is to put a value form approach to work, and in calling it a genealogical approach, this is something I'm bringing to a reading of Marx that isn't necessarily dominant in value form theory. To do all of that in an effort to diagnose our own contemporary condition of neoliberal capitalism. I think, unlike much of the work done within value form theory circles, I don't wish to presume an audience of Marx scholars, nor a terrain of Marx study. My goal is not to get Marx right, which is not to say that I want to get him wrong, but that I want to do something with him. The more I read value form theory, the more I was convinced it was a powerful and persuasive interpretation of Marx, and yet the harder I found it to write about the value form in Marx or value form theorists, because so much of the work is turned internally inwards, and it presumes a language and a lexicon and history in which everyone has all 3 volumes of Capital displayed on one's desk as one is reading. So I wanted to try to capture some of the important implications and insights of value form theory without simply doing value form theory. That explains the title of my talk today. I want to think about the so-called labor theory of value not as a true or false analytic theory that explains capitalism as an economic system. And theory and explains an economic system are all in quotation marks there. Instead, I want to consider the place of the labor theory of value within a capitalist social formation. And that means, for me, treating the labor theory of value as a particular type of story, asking where it comes from in the development of that social order, and considering what function it performs in the maintenance of that social order. So here I draw a close analogy between the work I'm doing and what I take to be one of Marx's most profound, yet often overlooked arguments. And this is one I talked about in a different context in my social formations book. In the 1857 intro, Marx advances a succinct and subtle, but I also think utterly devastating critique of state of nature theories. I think it's a few passages that should be taught anytime someone teaches Hobbes and Locke. Unlike so many recent challenges to contract theories, Marx's argument is not that the state of nature is hypothetical or that it is unrealistic, nor even that the conditions it imposes are problematic. Rather, Marx turns all that inside out and asks first, where does the idea of a state of nature come from? And he explains that such a theory is really just another of the many Robinsonades so popular at the time. In other words, classical political economy and modern political theory gets its founding ideas from a popular literary genre. They are telling Robinson Crusoe stories. And Marx takes this genealogy one step further by giving it a materialist twist when he asks, how did we get the idea of a Robinsonade in the first place? Where did the literary genre come from? And his answer, such stories are part and parcel of a larger social formation, one in which the bonds of feudal society have been broken, in which bourgeois revolutions have created conditions of equalization and individuation, conditions that themselves give rise to the very idea of what Marx incisively yet cuttingly calls the individuated individual. So we don't get the state of nature without Robinson Crusoe, and we don't get Robinson Crusoe without contract, wage labor, and all the rest. In a similar light, I think we could read David Graeber's Debt book in this context. Graeber gives a compelling account of the myth of barter as a story that capitalist societies tell themselves. And for me, Graeber's presentation of the myth of barter proves valuable, not because it exposes the story of barter as false, which it does, but because Graeber goes on to underscore the fact that the story of barter persists. Economists keep putting it in their textbooks. And it does so despite the fact that it has nothing whatsoever to do with actual economic history. As Graeber puts it, economists just ignore the work of anthropologists and historians and go on telling their just-so barter story. The narrative remains dominant because economics as a discipline requires it. So tonight what I want to do is highlight the ways that the labor theory of value is both like and unlike these other stories that capitalist societies tell themselves. In an early form of this talk, I was thinking that the labor theory of value was like the individuated individual, or like the myth of barter, that it was a capitalist myth. But I now think that's not quite right. I think it's more complex than that. So to clarify this, let me draw very roughly on some distinctions made by literary theorists, folklorists, and mythologists. Just one distinction, that between a myth, which we can say is a sacred narrative that is thought by societies to contain crucial truths. So a myth, even if it's not literally true, contains truth. Stephen Colbert would call it truthiness, I suppose. That's a myth. A fairy tale contrasts with a myth in that it refers to a story that is not only false, but could not possibly be true. In light of that distinction, I'm suggesting that the labor theory of value is not a myth that economists either call on or presuppose as if it told us something true about capitalism and its development. Barter, contract are myths. Instead, the labor theory of value is a fairy tale. That is, a story containing fairy creatures that could not possibly exist. It's a story we tell as if to children, to make it clear that no such thing ever happened or ever could happen. That means that the theory in the labor theory of value takes shape in its very refutation, or really just outright dismissal. As a theory, the labor theory of value is meant, in a sense, to be false, untenable, ridiculous. And yet its very status as a theory congeals through this critique. So with these ideas in place, we can make some clarifying syntheses. First, Marx is commonly read as subscribing to the classical labor theory of value, which would, on this account, make him both a believer in and a teller of fairy tales. My point, then, is not to refute this position by somehow showing that the labor theory of value is a true story or a valid theory. My point is that Marx is not telling such a tale, and he did not believe in it. Thirdly, though, and this is the subtle point, Marx was very much interested in the labor theory of value, and that is why he devoted enormous amounts of energy to studying it, to understanding it. Most of all, Marx was studying the very type of society in which such tales get told. He was always interested in the stories that capitalist societies tell themselves, since those stories tell us something very important about the society in question. Therefore, finally, while Marx didn't subscribe to a classical version of the labor theory of value as an analytic or economic theory, he did analyze and unravel it. So we might say that Marx was not an economist in either the classical or modern sense, but he was a folklorist. And in a way, I'm quite serious about this, because folklorists themselves are in earnest in their studies of fairy tales and what they tell us about a society. So unlike modern economists who feel no need to even address the labor theory of value, since it's nothing more than a fairy tale, Marx took the labor theory of value quite seriously. He wanted to tell his readers something about the way that capitalism establishes value. And to do this, he had to understand the relationship between value and labor under capitalism. I think this is what has been lost when we, 21st century subjects of neoliberal capitalism, no longer take the labor theory of value seriously, when we merely dismiss it as a fairy tale. In response to that, I'm saying both that it is a fairy tale and that we should study it rigorously. To do this means to analyze the historical development of capitalism as a process through which bourgeois society establishes value by setting up a certain relationship between labor and value. My main point of emphasis here is that it is a capitalist social formation that establishes this relation. That relation is historical, social, and contingent. So we might narrate the history. My main point here is not history, but to sum up this kind of opening description, I would say we might narrate the history this way. In Marx's time, barter and the state of nature had not yet fully become myths. They were often proposed as political or economic theories, and for that reason Marx made them the target of his critique. In our time, barter and the state of nature have become myths, thought to contain truth value, even if they are not literally true. This is why economists can continue to proffer the myth of barter without actually defending any historical arguments about the real emergence of barter. And in Marx's time, the labor theory of value was also presented as a theory. Marx treated it instead as a myth, since he saw that it contained a truth, but that truth lay in the historical development of a social order, not in intrinsic properties of labor. The confusion then, the complicating factor, is that in our time, thanks to the work of the marginalists and the neoliberals, the labor theory of value has been transformed into a mere fairy tale. As such, the labor theory of value today contrasts with what, in a different talk, which is not this one, I might spend more time on, which is what I think would be the real myth, which is price theory. The idea that markets magically establish value through the objective truth of the price mechanism. The marginalist and neoclassical revolution gives us this. The labor theory of value is therefore a fairy tale that helps to prop up price theory, not as the myth it is, but as truth itself. Now, my overall conclusions are going to look like this. Just a few fundamental points I want to try to make. The first is that within a capitalist society, value appears only in social form. Its source can never lie outside the social formation. That means, for example, in properties of labor, in capacities of gold, or anything else. Value only appears in social form. This means, secondly, that the task for a student, an observer, or a critic of capitalism is to analyze the form that value takes within that social order. Thirdly, Marx himself was exactly this sort of student of capitalism. He scrutinized the form of value under capitalism. And he showed, I will argue, the following: that within a social order dominated by the basic logic of capital, value necessarily takes the form of exchange value, of price, of money. Therefore, the capitalist system itself asserts a value relation, such that labor appears as the so-called source of value. But finally, and most importantly, there are absolutely no intrinsic properties of labor that produce value. It is only a series of relations established by capitalism that link up value with labor as its source and price as its ultimate form. So what I want to do now is go back to what is for me the start, to try to work through that overall logic and exemplify and illustrate those 3 points. That the social order, dominated by the logic of capital, value takes the form of exchange value, price, and money. That a capitalist system asserts a value relation such that labor appears as the source of value, but that thirdly, there are no intrinsic properties of labor that produce value. Before I start that, one point I wish to underscore from beginning to end, which is really, in a sense, a structural element in everything I do here, and goes back to the first lecture when I talked about the social formation. The question of value within a capitalist social order is not random or ancillary, for the very reason that the relationship between capitalism and value is not arbitrary. Because one of the things that capitalism does is establish relations of value. By definition, then, capitalism tells us plainly that money and commodities are valuable. And we can therefore start an analysis simply there, with what commodities and money look like in value terms under capitalism. Capitalism gives us a robust language of value in the shape of numerical monetary value. We know what things are worth in capitalism by looking at their price, and we know that everything has its price. This means not only that capitalism gives us a consistent and standardized framework for valuing, but also that anything that appears to fall outside of that framework can be translated back into it. Indeed, we often find it difficult to pose the question of value, making what I just said seem kind of too obvious as to be strange. We don't pose the question of value because our social order makes it seem as if value is not a question. Value is just a fact. It's written on the surface of things in the form of price. That is, the question of value under capitalism no longer seems to be a question for artists, philosophers, novelists, or citizens. It's always and above all a question for economists and lawyers, and ultimately of accountants. Value is located on the price tag, but if it cannot easily be found there, then it surely can be traced to the budget or tracked on the Excel spreadsheet. Put bluntly, in today's capitalist society, we no longer ask the question of where value comes from because its answer is always obvious, if implicit. It comes from the market. At this point, almost all of modern economics simply leaves the question of value behind. Indeed, everything I've just said in the last few minutes is something that modern economics textbooks would see no need to even say. It's just too obvious to articulate. Value drops out of the equation for modern economics because there is no problem of value. This is because for them, market and price mechanisms do the work they do objectively and concretely without the need for any further explanation. Now, my point of departure in the chapter upon which this lecture is based is to go back to the classical political economists at exactly this point. And you might ask why on earth we should do that. Why go back to the 17th or even as far back as the 15th century to address this question? And my answer is because modern economics' implicit answer to the question of values, that is, the price mechanism, the objectivity of the market, would not satisfy classical political economy in the least. The classical political economists would find this everyday common sense that I've just been summarizing about value taking the form of price as utterly inadequate. They would see it as a form of question begging. One of the advantages that the classical political economists have is that they see capitalism as new and odd and strange, where we take it as normal and natural. Because writing during the transition from feudalism to capitalism, they are not as in a hurry to naturalize capitalism as we sometimes are. And I think that whenever a set of discourses in the past can provide us a critical perspective on our present, asking questions that we wouldn't ask, then we are operating in the realm of genealogy. And so a genealogical return to the discourse of classical political economy can help us to render our present-day common sense strange or unfamiliar. And it's by constituting a certain alterity of the present, making our present strange, that the work of genealogy helps generate what Foucault called the history of the present. So in the paper, I turn to a text where I think Marx can be understood to be doing genealogical work. Marx gives us a genealogical account of political economy's series of answers to the question of value. And I explore this in detail in a published book of Marx's that's often overlooked, the 1859 Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Zur Kritik. Unlike the so-called Grundrisse and unlike Capital Volume 1, Zur Kritik foregrounds Marx's own interpretations and criticisms of classical political economy. So we see in this text Marx very explicitly reading other classical political economists. It's not in the footnotes as it would be in Capital Volume 1, and it's not as much displaced to the margins as it might be in the Grundrisse. And a side note here, every reader of Marx knows and often notes the basic facts that Marx was providing a critique of classical political economy. But it's surprising how little attention goes to showing what Marx took from classical political economy. Much of Marx's polemic against so many of his contemporaries often consists in his pointing out to them that they don't understand their Ricardo. And also, we fail to appreciate exactly how he mobilizes his criticisms. So, Zur Kritik offers an amazing view of exactly these dimensions of Marx's thought, because you can see exactly what he's saying about classical political economists at the time. So I think we actually learn, in some ways, more about what Marx thought concerning labor, value, and commodities when we carefully work through his teasing out of ideas and launching of criticisms against classical political economy, and a lot of points that are more subtle or open to interpretive debate in later versions of Marx's presentation of things like the commodity and value, where the engagement with classical political economy drops out. They're more starkly clear in this text because you can see him getting angry with Smith and Ricardo, writing dismissively against them. And in some cases in the later text, he's taking ideas of theirs and presenting them as in a way that they can be read as a kind of simplistic, straightforward truth. So I'm using this reading of a contribution to the critique of political economy to show that the standard narrative of the labor theory of value as an abstract, analytic, and above all, theoretical account of where value comes from, that is a narrative that simplifies the text of classical political economy and gets Marx badly, badly wrong. So I want to summarize the conclusions of that genealogy. And here just briefly, something you all probably know, but worth having in front of us before I work through this argument. The labor theory of value, if we take it as a kind of textbook account, is designed to boil things down into the simplest terms, into sort of the elemental particles that make up capitalism. As such, the labor theory of value states straightforwardly that value comes from labor. Labor which has an intrinsic, essential, indeed universal power to bestow value on the objects it produces. So the innate source of value in commodities is thus the labor required to create those commodities in the first place. And so value in society can be traced directly to labor as its source. On this standard account, the labor theory of value provides a direct, concise, and sharp account of value in relation to capitalist commodities, and it generalizes this account to an understanding of value across all time and place. However, Marx's genealogy of the classical political economists makes it starkly, I think unquestionably clear, that he himself does not endorse, support, or in any way subscribe to this textbook view of the labor theory of value. For me, the key pivot point in my reading of Marx and the classical political economists is the following. At its core, the labor theory of value rests on an idea of labor itself, on an abstract, transcendental, generalized conception of labor. So the labor theory of value tells us that labor has certain ontological characteristics that give it the capacity to constitute value in an object that it produces, i.e. a commodity. But it is precisely the idea of labor itself, an idea at the heart of this classical version of the labor theory of value, that Marx takes Smith and Ricardo and the other classical political economists to task for endorsing. On my reading, Marx instead carries out the following theoretical labors and achievements in his genealogical reading of the classical political economists. There are two primarily. One is what I underscore as a fundamental distinction between labor itself and labor in general. Labor itself, let me start with labor in general. Labor in general is an abstraction, but it is a real abstraction in that it is a real historical achievement of capitalism. It is the historical product of a particular social formation, which is the focus of Marx's analysis, labor in general. Labor itself, on the other hand, is a transhistorical philosophical concept that Marx has very little, if any, interest in and puts aside. Marx shows that capitalism creates abstract labor, that is labor in general. And he calls the idea of labor in general, or labor sans phrase, an immense step forward. He credits Smith with discovering labor in general as an immense step forward in our understanding of labor under capitalism. Yet at the same time, he decisively rejects the idea that capitalism or any other social order could erase the very difference between concrete labors, say weaving and painting, for example, or that those concrete labors could be equalized. And I'll come back to those points. Secondly then, building on this distinction between labor in general and labor itself, Marx offers a careful, subtle, and detailed analysis of a unique new entity that capitalist social orders produce. Marx claims that capitalism creates a whole new object when it produces a new type of labor. And Marx refers to this with the phrase Tauschwert setzenden Arbeit. And I spend a lot of time on this phrase in my paper. A literal translation of the phrase is actually fairly straightforward, even if it produces something somewhat awkward in English. Tauschwert is the noun for exchange value, Arbeit is the noun for labor, and setzende is a present participle meaning setting or positing. So this gives us one long hyphenated noun, exchange value setting labor, or exchange value positing labor. And this translation actually nicely captures Marx's argument for the historical production by capitalism of a unique type of labor. As I read Marx, what he's showing us is that a social order under capitalism creates this new object that is this type of labor, exchange value setting labor, exchange value positive labor. And that is a massive accomplishment that requires analysis and study. Now, English versions of Zur Kritik miss this point when they translate the phrase Tauschwert setzenden Arbeit as labor which posits or labor which produces exchange value. So they take the present participle setzende as the verb setzen, and they falsely transform labor from an object named by Marx into a type of subject carrying out its own action, setting exchange value. Thus becomes an action and a property of labor, something labor itself does. And you can already see how this might resonate with the classical textbook conception of the labor theory of value, in which labor has these capacities and powers to do things. But Marx, I argue, is not attributing properties or capacities to a generic labor. And in the paper, I have an extended discussion of why it's wrong to think of this as a property of labor. It is, in fact, a new type of object, a new creation of a capitalist social order that is this type of labor. He is identifying a type of labor produced by a capitalist social formation that is exchange value setting labor. And so exchange value setting labor, exchange value positing labor, is the historical achievement of capitalism. What capitalism does is create this new object, exchange value positing labor. And to identify this historical production is already to reject a classical variant of the labor theory of value. So I try to show that Marx's genealogical perspective simply exposes the labor theory of value as itself a rather strange idea. For Marx, labor has no intrinsic metaphysical powers that would allow it to create value. The classical political economists sometimes did see labor as the source of value in the sense of a certain Ursprung, a metaphysical origin. But Marx, in the way I'm reading him genealogically, saw it differently because his genealogy refused this idea to begin with. He rejected the notion of any fundamental, elementary particle that would lie outside the social formation and causally explain productions within it. And therefore his critique is a displacement of that entire paradigm of classical political economy. He's offering a new way to understand value in a social order. The creation of value under capitalism is always, for Marx, a systemic effect of a capitalist social order. This is the context in which I think it makes sense to see the labor theory of value as a fairy tale. The labor theory of value solidifies, congeals, and takes shape as a narrative, not through its narration by its advocates, as with the myth of barter. Rather, the story takes form through the idea that the labor theory of value was held by the classical political economist, and that it was clung to even more dearly by Marx, with the difference between the two consisting in Marx's own supposed ethical commitments to labor's value as the true source of value under capitalism. Now, in response to all of this, the neoclassical economists, forming the foundation for modern economics today, easily reject all this wishy-washy value nonsense and establish price theory based on marginal utility, never looking back, as it were. By making the labor theory of value a fairy tale held to by backwards economists and dumb Marxists, the marginalists and the modern economists elevate the myth of price theory as the truth of the market economy. And it's in this context, I think, we can see the political significance of Marx's work, my work on Marx, as a folklorist. It's showing that neoliberal economics is wrong to ignore value, and that it can only do so on the basis of the myth of price theory, itself a rejection of the labor theory of value as a fairy tale. So while orthodox Marxists are also wrong in this sense to romanticize labor, since that too misses Marx's main point. So the status of the labor theory of value is a different sort of story that capitalist societies tell themselves takes shape. Unlike the myth of barter, which is a developmental myth, the labor theory of value is a fairy tale, or perhaps we might call it a theoretical myth, that is more like the ether in 19th and early 20th century physics, a theory once held to but now definitively rejected. None of this changes the fact that Marx himself never held to a labor theory of value, and in its classical variant, in the idea that labor establishes value transhistorically, he shows clearly how the theory is utterly false. I've also been trying here to show why Marx is wrongly mistaken for a labor theory of value theorist. And that is because his goal is not merely to refute an abstract analytic theory, to refute it as a theory, but to show how something like the labor theory of value could emerge within capitalism in the first place. That in doing the genealogical work of demonstrating the emergence of the labor theory of value, he's mistaken for actually upholding it. I would bracket there a separate issue of why he's thought to do that, which has to do with the readings of the 1844 manuscripts. Let me put it this way. In his work as a folklorist, Marx is recognized as a myth maker. The two are related but not at all the same. Marx was already showing how the labor theory of value could come into existence as a story, even as he was wrongly taken to be shoring up the labor theory of value as a true theory. And so for me, value form theory offers a powerful reading of Marx as rejecting the labor theory of value. But more than this, value form theory helps us to see the status of a myth or a fairy tale within a social formation. And it's in this context that I want briefly to highlight, so as to solidify the story I've been telling here, to highlight the important writings of I.I. Rubin, whose work from the 1920s is without a doubt a form of value form theory avant lelette. Rubin's writings nicely illustrate this point through his crucial account of fetishism. So contrary to many interpretations of Marx both before and continuing on after, Rubin contends that fetishism is not a supplementary feature of Marx's argument in Capital. Rubin declares instead, quote, "The theory of fetishism is per se the basis of Marx's entire economic system and in particular of his theory of value," end quote. 2 points to summarize from Rubin. First, fetishism is not something that may or may not happen to or in relation with commodities. Rather, fetishism proves to be so primary that the phrase commodity fetishism becomes in a way redundant. And 2, Marx's conceptualization of value in a social order operationalizes or exemplifies the logic of fetishism. So let me expand on these 2 points. First, by just looking quickly at the standard view, by which fetishism indicates that relations between things, that is commodities, mask or hide relations among people, particularly in the form of production relations. In this way, the theory of fetishism proves to be critical in the sense of demystifying. It unmasks illusions, showing that commodity relations are only superficial appearances, underlain by the true essence of human relations. Now for Rubin, this reading is not so much wrong as terribly limited and one-sided. For Rubin, seeing human relations behind commodity relations is only part of the story, and the other part proves more significant and more surprising. So Rubin says, quote, "In the commodity economy, social production relations inevitably took the form of things, and could not be expressed except through things. The structure of the commodity economy causes things to play a particular and highly important social role, and thus to acquire particular social properties," end quote. I'll gloss this colloquially. Sure, Marx says that the relation between things obscures relations among people, but that was not his main point. The point was not to unmask, the point was to figure out how and why this masking occurred, to understand how within capitalism, relations of production had to take the form of relations between commodities, to ascertain the logic of capital itself so as to grasp how things take on social roles, social functions, social forms. Fetishism is therefore not the name for our misunderstood, mystified grasp of commodities as having certain social powers, and the theory of fetishism is not designed to dispel this illusion. The reason should now be obvious. Within capitalism, commodities really do have such social powers. Fetishism is not a mistake we make as individuals, a poor choice to worship false idols. Fetishism names the very structure of a capitalist social order. Rubin puts it this way: fetishism is not, quote, "a phenomenon of social consciousness, but of social being," end quote. Now, what does Rubin's interpretation of Marx, according to the logic of fetishism, have to do with the value form? I think it has everything to do with it. That is, to grasp fetishism as foundational to Marx's understanding of a capitalist social formation means to work toward understanding the form that value takes and must take in capitalism. Hence, the misreading of Marx on value follows directly from the narrow reading of fetishism. Both are one-sided and problematic in the same way. They see that Marx has identified an appearance and something that lies beneath it, but they fail to decoct from this analysis that the appearance is not false, but necessary. In this context, Rubin explains the error of what he calls vulgar economics, which cannot see the link between material technical forms and the social form of production. Vulgar economics misses the fact that material forms emerge from and in relation to the social forms. Instead, economists falsely derive material forms from, quote, the natural properties of things. They mistakenly and routinely misapprehend social forms as eternal and natural forms because they never ask how such forms originate. They never ask the genetic, historical, genealogical question. So the power of Marx's analysis lies in his capacity to ask the question that political economists never broached. Why does labor assume the form of value? In asking this question, Marx breaks entirely within a standard account of the labor theory of value. And what is more, he makes it possible to rethink the relationship between value and labor under capitalism, and perhaps beyond it. The answer to the question of what is the common substance that equalizes commodities under capitalism is not to be provided analytically by Marx. It is provided dialectically by the historical development of a capitalist social formation. So to repeat that in a different language, the question, what renders commodities equal, is not a philosophical question, but an historical one. And therefore the answer cannot simply be labor, that is, labor itself. That would amount to an analytic deductive answer that posits labor itself as having the property of producing value. The answer has to be a historical, genealogical one. Under capitalism, labor creates value, but only abstract labor, labor in general, as a highly developed social form achieved by a capitalist historical development can do this. Exchange value positing labor is precisely the kind of labor that creates value, but it is a specific object produced concretely and definitively by a capitalist social formation. In a way, Marx is not providing his own answer to where value comes from. He's analyzing and deconstructing the very answer given by the historical development of capitalist social formations. Value is not traced to labor by way of a metaphysics, but by way of a system of capitalist production, distribution, and exchange, that is, through political economy itself. Like all laws of political economy, the so-called labor theory of value is not Marx's theory, and in a way it's not even Smith's and Ricardo's. It's capitalism's theory. So to say that Marx utterly reconfigured the labor theory of value in his analysis of the genetic development of a capitalist social order, this fact fundamentally alters our interpretation of Marx and, I'm arguing, our overall relation to capitalism, because it changes the way we conceptualize the capitalism-value relation. That is, if exchange value is the necessary form of appearance of value under capitalism, and that's basically a direct quote from Marx, then to take an approach to capitalism inspired by Marx's analysis means to refuse the idea of locating value outside the social formation. A society's values cannot be independent of the social order itself. Rather than serve as a cause for that social order, those values must emanate from within it. This insight helps explain why Marx was so very critical of what he saw as ethical critiques of capitalism, like those made by Proudhon and so many other utopian socialists. Marx's study of the capitalist value form showed him that it was impossible to offer a transformative critique of capitalism by opposing a new set of values to it. The reason why is crucial. Capitalism does not offer a choice of value systems. It produces and imposes its own. Therefore, the only way to oppose capitalism is to undo and to remake its structures, not to value those structures or their effects differently. The latter turns out to be a definitional impossibility. I think that Marx's ideas on value have sometimes been neglected or dismissed or even wrongly defended because his radical displacement of the labor theory of value was misunderstood as something else, as merely an internal challenge to classical political economy on its own terrain. And that question of ethical critique centers right there. It's the difference between Ricardo and a left Marxist Ricardian who is simply valuing labor differently. Yet Marx's critique of classical political economy hinges on rethinking value in a social order entirely, and therefore on demonstrating that value is itself a political category. So Marx provides a unique way to understand value in the first place, and in so doing, he may have been the only thinker to explain deeply and thoroughly how value works under capitalism. Now, I kind of want to allow those lines to stand as my peroration to close tonight's talk on that note, but since this is the last lecture of the spring, I just want to add one quick footnote concerning the larger project, which is to say that once we understand the value form as a product of a capitalist social formation, we can quickly see that value is socio-political, and in the same way, a capitalist social order is politico-economic. This insight allows me to underscore and to reformulate the central claim I made against Brown's analysis of neoliberalism. There's no option of opposing Homo economicus to Homo politicus, as if one of those creatures were a part of, an essential element in the capitalist social order, and the other somehow remained outside of it. Once we understand value as a social form, we see it as socio-political through and through. Value in this way, to see value in this way means to entangle immediately and indissociably those strands that Brown's analysis purports and requires to remain separate. Moreover, and now looking forward rather than back, value form theory's conceptualization of the social formation fundamentally reorients us with respect to Homo economicus as a creature produced and sustained within that social formation of neoliberal capitalism. Rather than merely stand against this creature, we must ask how he or she is produced, in what particular form, and with what specific implications. And at this juncture, I am particularly interested in exploring the 21st century form of Homo economicus, the entrepreneur, which might, I think, be a form of the entrepreneur distinct from the one that Foucault identified almost half a century ago. Of course, these questions are in no way extrinsic to the discussion of value, since in today's capitalist economies, the entrepreneur is frequently identified by neoliberal discourses as the essential source for the creation of value, almost in a sense standing in for labor in the classical textbook account of the labor theory of value. Indeed, if asked directly today, in the context of neoliberal discourse's hegemony, the question, where does value come from, appears to have only one answer: from entrepreneurs and entrepreneurships. Perhaps then that figure is a site ripe for transformation. Thank you.